So first, I just want to say thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us about your book and about your time in the Trump administration. We really appreciate it. I'd like to start with something that's been in the news recently, which is the U.S.-backed peace talks in Afghanistan. You write in your book that the Taliban are ruthless, inhumane, misogynistic, and completely intertwined with al-Qaida, the group responsible for 9/11. I may have missed a few adjectives of yours. You also say that U.S. efforts to broker a deal with the Taliban was based on a fantasy. And so I wanted to get your take on the current state of play. This agreement that the Trump administration struck in February, what's your assessment of it, especially the part about freeing 5,000 Taliban fighters?
Right. Well, Deirdre, thanks for the opportunity to be with you and to talk about battlegrounds. And what I write about in the book is this tendency on our part toward what I define as strategic narcissism, the tendency to define complex problems as we would like them to be, or enemies as we would like them to be. And I think that's what we've done in Afghanistan. We did it under the Obama administration by creating this myth that there was this bold line between the Taliban and al-Qaida. What one great analyst on Afghanistan says is that we try too hard to disconnect the dots. And then we don't consider adequately, I think, what are the emotions, the aspirations, and the ideology that drives the other, that drives the enemy. And so I think what we've done is we've created this idea that the Taliban can be partners for peace, when in fact they're determined to establish an Islamic caliphate in Afghanistan, and to use that Islamic caliphate as a base for expansion more broadly. And in doing so, they partner with, and they're part of an ecosystem in which these other terrorist groups exist, and they share people, and they share resources, and training, and expertise. And they also share this hate-filled ideology, an ideology that's used to justify violence against innocents.
So how do you think these talks what will the end result of these talks be?
I think the end results of the talks will be failure, because the Taliban, I think, will expose their true nature. They won't be able to help themselves. I think right now they're doing what they also do well, which is deceit and deceiving. I think some of us who want to be deceived about the nature of their objectives. But what does power sharing with the Taliban look like? I mean, does that look like really every other girls' school bulldozed, or does it look like mass executions in the soccer stadium every other Saturday?
So can I come back to the question about the fighters who've been freed under this U.S. negotiated deal? Right. Describe who are these people that have now been freed under the auspices of this agreement?
Yeah. These are people, in large measure, who have committed mass murder against innocents, because that has been the Taliban's principal tactic in its war against Afghans, and I would say a war that, along with these other groups, that they wage against all civilized peoples. And these are people who are very committed to this warped, what I would say is a criminal ideology. And they're not going to give it up. I mean, I think what's instructive when you think about the release of these prisoners in Afghanistan is to compare that to the release of al-Qaida in Iraq prisoners in 2011. Those former prisoners were the foundation for al-Qaida 2.0, which was ISIS, the most brutal terrorist and most destructive terrorist group in history.
So you don't think they're going to renounce al-Qaida, their ties to al-Qaida, which is part of this deal?
No. And they haven't really. They've made motions toward it. They've made superficial statements. But when you look at their documents, what they say about al-Qaida and the Haqqani network, which is this really particularly brutal network, which is a bridge in many ways between the Taliban and al-Qaida, and between the Taliban and the intelligence wing of the Pakistani army, who also helps to foster this terrorist ecosystem along the Afghanistan-Pakistan border.
What does failure mean for the United States in the long run then?
Well, failure means it would be a physical failure in terms of then the Taliban could take over large swaths of territory, which we know is important to them because it allows them to mobilize people and resources and conduct training in an environment that's unmolested. This was the problem in al-Qaida going back to the 1990s. And you remember the Clinton administration fired a few cruise missiles at Osama bin Laden and called it a day. Right. Well, that was the group that committed the mass murder on our soil, mass murders on our soil that killed nearly 3,000 innocents on September 11th, 2001. So it gives them the space and the resources to be able to plan those kind of attacks. But also, it could give them a tremendous psychological victory. Do you remember when ISIS had established territory, the control of territory the size of Great Britain, and they established the caliphate, and they sent out those slick recruiting videos? And what they do is they draw young, impressionable people into their cause, brainwash them, and then use that hatred that they fill them with to justify violence. So I think it could be a very dangerous place. There are two geographic areas that have great ideological significance to these enemies of all humanity. One is the so-called Khorasan region, which includes Afghanistan, parts of Pakistan, and Iran, and the other is the Fertile Crescent, the land of the two rivers, the Euphrates and Tigris river valleys. And this is what they're focused on first. And they really believe it. I mean, when we read what they say, you think, well, this sounds kind of Dr. Evil-esque, right? I mean, but they actually are determined to do it. And because they are so unscrupulous, because they have really no reluctance at all to commit the most egregious acts, like the Taliban did recently in a maternity hospital in Kabul, where they gunned down expectant mothers and newborn babies. So we have to remember, what is the nature of this enemy? What is their objective? And that's what I argue in Battlegrounds, is we oftentimes skip over that step of really thinking clearly and holistically about who our enemy is and what they're trying to achieve.
So in the end, do you think this could mean another 9/11 potentially?
I think the risk is very high. And I think that it is not extreme to say, or it's not really embellishing to say that we I think are in many ways more at risk today than we were on September 10th, 2001. And there are really three reasons for that. First of all, these terrorist enemies are much larger in magnitude. The people who committed mass murder on September 11th, 2001 were the Mujahideen era alumni of the resistance to the Soviet occupation of Afghanistan. Mm-hmm. Now we're facing the al-Qaida alumni, the ISIS alumni, and the alumni of many other groups like Lashkar-e-Taiba in Pakistan. So it's a bigger threat. It's also, though, a second reason is it's a threat that's more capable because they're more mobile. Many of these ISIS recruits came from Europe and go back to Europe. And by the way, there's not a visa requirement for travel from Europe to the United States. And they're more capable because of what we might call the democratization of destruction. I describe in the book how these groups are pursuing so aggressively the most destructive weapons on earth, weapons that we thought before, hey, those are only weapons that nation states have. These aren't weapons that a terrorist organization could have. And the third reason I think they're becoming more dangerous is because there is a very strong sentiment in the United States across both political parties to disengage from these complex problem sets overseas. And I think if we don't stay engaged, not with us as the primary fighters against these groups, but as really critical friends and enablers of those who are taking the brunt of the fight. Hey, in Afghanistan today, 30 Afghan soldiers or police are dying every day, fighting the enemies not only of Afghans, but as I mentioned, these are the enemies of all humanity.
I want to move to another hotspot, North Korea. You made it very clear that you didn't agree with the president's decision to meet with Kim Jong-un, but you didn't think it was worth trying to talk him out of it because he would see it as irresistible. What has the U.S. gained from these summits with Kim Jong-un versus what North Korea has gained?
Well, what I describe in the book is that I thought it was really important that we not repeat the failed pattern of previous efforts to denuclearize North Korea. And that failed pattern is that North Korea provokes us, right, with nuclear attacks or long-range missile tests, and then they use that provocation to get us to beg to have negotiations. They then seek concessions just for the privilege of talking to them, which is usually in the form of big payoffs and sanctions relief. And then we start at bottom up, really frustrating, long, drawn out negotiations that result in what really a weak agreement that locks in the status quo as the new normal. And then guess what? North Korea breaks it with the next provocation and we repeat the cycle. So we can't do that again. So as I knew the president would not pass on this opportunity for a summit, and there were advantages to that. Okay, bottom up doesn't work, so at least this is top down. But the key would be for us not to alleviate the sanctions, which is what North Korea really wanted, until there was irreversible momentum towards denuclearization. So I saw the talks as not inherently bad, and actually the failure of the second Kim Jong-un summit in Hanoi, that was really good, because the president stuck to his guns and we didn't compromise in a way that repeated that failed pattern of past efforts.
But are you concerned that we've given Kim Jong-un some legitimacy through these summits and he's bought a lot of time? Yeah,
I think that is a concern, but what we have going for us now is thanks to Nikki Haley, who did an amazing job as U.S. ambassador in getting the most strident sanctions in place in North Korea. They're imperfectly, they're imperfectly enforced because China's not helping us as much as they could. But there is an opportunity, at least, to enforce those sanctions. And North Korea has a lot of problems these days, right? I think the best enforcer of UN sanctions may have been COVID-19 and the shutdown of the borders. I think if we're better at interdiction, we're stopping a lot of the smuggling around those sanctions. And if China realizes, hey, it's not in China's interest for there to be a nuclear North Korea, there is still a chance, I think, to convince Kim Jong-un that he is better off without nuclear weapons than he is with them. And that's what I lay out in Battlegrounds. That ought to be really the thesis we're testing, is that we can convince him that he's better off without nukes.
When you were President Trump's national security advisor, you managed to persuade him to stay in the Iran nuclear deal and try to fix the flaws from within. Right. Soon after you left, he withdrew the United States from the agreement, and now Iran is enriching uranium in, at levels never before. How can the Trump administration keep its promise to prevent Iran from getting a nuclear weapon, given that the deal seems to be in shreds now?
Yeah. Well, I wasn't a big fan of the deal either. I saw it as my job to give the president multiple options. Okay, you can stay in the deal and say it's great, which he would never do, but you can stay in the deal and say it's a bad deal for us, not to certify under domestic legislation like was required in a super painful review, like every 4 months, that to certify that was in our interest. We didn't have to do that, but we could adhere to the deal in the near term, really as a way to convince our allies, Europeans in particular, that we have to sanction Iranian behavior that falls outside the deal. And we have to recognize the flaws in the deal, especially the fact that the inspection regime is really inadequate. It's not transparent enough. This could give cover to them to pursue a nuclear weapon. That if we convince our European allies by staying in the near term, that it was worth the effort to do that. And the argument I made to the president, as I describe in the book, is, hey, once you pull out, you've pulled out. Until you pulled out, you have that leverage. Well, so once we did pull out, the sanctions did snap back. I think that's actually very good to constrain the resources that Iran has, not just for its nuclear program, but to continue to wage its 40-year-long proxy war against the great Satan, the United States, the little Satan, Israel, and the Arab monarchies. So I wanted to give the president options, and then I knew that the time was limited, and especially after my successor came in, it was just a matter of time. I don't think anybody would have taken the odds on staying in the nuclear deal after that. Just
back to my question, do you think that the Trump administration can bar Iran from getting a nuclear weapon at this point, or is it too late?
Well, it's clear right now that the Iran nuclear deal wasn't working either, right? Because Iran already is enriching uranium far beyond what was in the deal. And it's before the ink was dry. What I write about in the book is, before the ink was dry on the agreement with the Obama administration, the Iranians started saying, oh, you can't look at that site, you can't look at former military sites. And given the behavior of that regime, ever since the revolution, ever since they took 77 Americans hostage, right, for so long, ever since they bombed our embassy and the Marine barracks in Lebanon in 1983. And we could go on with the multiple terrorist attacks, the Khobar Towers bombing in 1996, the killing of over 600 of our soldiers through proxies in Iraq during the Iraq War. How could they be trusted? Of course they can't be trusted. And so I think that it wasn't a bad thing to get out of the deal later. The deal, of course, the Iran nuclear deal for us was not a treaty, mainly because President Obama and his advisors knew it would never pass our Congress anyway. Mm-hmm. So I really, by the end, I was kind of ambivalent about it, but in what I describe in the book is my argument to use the leverage we had. What I was afraid of happened, right? As soon as we pulled out, the conversation shifted away from all of Iran's destructive and murderous behavior in the region to us, right? To criticism of us. And that's what I had hoped to avoid, at least for some time.
After you left the National Security Advisor role, the Trump administration moved to disband a global pandemic unit inside the National Security Council. How much do you think that contributed to the slow response to the COVID-19 crisis?
Deirdre, I don't know how much, 'cause I was gone by that point. I think it's clear that we were behind in some key areas. When it was my job to help plan this, I should have done better too. We focused on 3 areas that were critical to COVID response. One is detect an outbreak early and contain it at the source. Well, thanks to the Chinese Communist Party, we couldn't do that. The second key area is to innovate. Innovate to rapidly develop therapies, but actually, more importantly, to rapidly develop a vaccine. That's going extremely well. And over many years, we've invested money into the infrastructure to do that, and that's going to pay off. The third area where we fell short is on mobilizing the medical response and putting the proper protocols in place to flatten the disease initially, but then to generate all the PPE that we needed. But really, this is a problem that developed over many years, where our supply chains became too fragile. We emphasized efficiency and just-in-time delivery. Many of these supply chains were overly dependent on China as the source. So we've learned a lot of hard lessons. We had to play catch-up because we didn't have the time. We were in a sprint to recover. And now I hope we've learned those lessons and we'll be prepared not just for maybe another wave of this virus, but for the next biomedical emergency.
Well, as you know, President Trump has given mixed messages about the deadliness of the virus, whether wearing masks is good or bad, whether how quickly a vaccine will be available. How would you rate the president's handling of the pandemic?
Well, a pandemic is not a clear problem set initially, and we've learned a lot. A lot of the projections and models, information have been bad. And what you need is, I think, the messaging from the president, simple, clear messaging to be as consistent as possible, given the ambiguity of your interaction with this new type of virus. I would say that the administration has not done well on this, and this is probably one of the biggest shortcomings. I mean, I think it lends to greater anxiety on the part of the public, and I know that there are these reports now, that the president wanted to downplay it so people didn't panic. But in my experience as a military commander, the more you tell your soldiers about even the most dangerous mission, it's going to allay their concerns and it's going to encourage them to take initiative. I think the most positive thing about our response to COVID is what the private sector has done and how so many people in business, and especially our healthcare workers and medical workers and first responders, they really rose to the challenge. We ought to celebrate that, and of course try to empower them. And I think one of the ways to empower them is with a better, more consistent message.
Okay. General McKenzie recently announced a reduction in U.S. forces in Iraq from about 5,000 troops to 3,000. He also announced that troop levels in Afghanistan would drop to about 4,500 by November. These timetables seem driven by the election and President Trump's promises to end endless wars. Tell me how you think each of these decisions will impact the situation on the ground in those countries.
Well, what I point out in battlegrounds is that wars don't end when one side decides to disengage, right? I mean, this is the element of what I call strategic narcissism in the book, right? That we define really the situation and the future course of events depending on what we would envision. But of course, war and any competition, even in foreign policy, is a continuous interaction of opposites, and therefore the future course of events depends not just on what you decide to do, but what on your adversaries, your enemies decide to do. So I think this may neglect the degree to which our enemies have authorship over the future. Mm-hmm. And what we want to do is not err on the side of disengagement as an unmitigated good, and therefore create a void or an opportunity for that enemy to exploit. That's what happened in December 2011 when we withdrew all of our forces from Iraq. And then that was the beginning of the rise of ISIS. And it's worth the insurance policy. And the numbers that you just quoted, 4,500 in Afghanistan, 4,000 in Iraq, those are very, very small numbers from a historical perspective relative to both those conflicts, but really just to U.S. military engagement overseas. And the reason they're small is because others are bearing the brunt of those fights, and we're enabling them to do that.
The president has also ordered 12,000 troops to leave Germany, and this is seen as in part a rebuke to Angela Merkel. And it's sparked bipartisan opposition in Congress, with lawmakers saying that this is abandoning a key ally in Europe and that it will embolden Russia and China. Do you share those concerns, or what's your assessment of this?
Well, I do share those concerns, because I think that what's important is to ensure that you have a deterrent capability in Europe, because you can't prove a negative, right? You can't prove that those forces are guaranteed to prevent the next great power war with a revisionist Russia who has been extremely aggressive. But what we do know is that the best form of deterrence that seems to work is deterrence by denial, which means convincing your adversary that they cannot accomplish their objectives through the use of force. Mm-hmm. And so our military capabilities as part of a cohesive alliance, an alliance to which we lend a great deal of that cohesion, is immensely important, because deterrence comes from not just your capability and the size of your forces, but your will to be able to fight together. And what we've seen with Russia is they're using different forms of aggression, a more pernicious form of aggression that what I describe in battlegrounds, like I call it Russian new generation warfare, right, or Putin's playbook. And so we have to be able to deter from a conventional military perspective, but also from a political warfare perspective, and really psychologically. And I'm concerned that those withdrawals will weaken at a time when it appears as if the Kremlin ordered the poisoning with a military-grade agent of Putin's biggest adversary, and at a time when the Kremlin is rattling sabers to suppress a movement for freedom in Belarus.
Right. You said that we didn't do enough to punish Russia for its interference in the 2016 election. What are the consequences of that for the 2020 election?
Well, I think it's important with Vladimir Putin to impose costs on the Kremlin that are greater than the costs they factor in at the beginning of their decision making. And the stories that I tell in Battlegrounds are about how we endeavored to do that. Mm-hmm. And we took very strong action against Russia in 2017 and into 2018, most notably after the Skripal poisoning. Remember in Salisbury in March, I think it was, of 2018, when the Russians attempted to murder Sergei Skripal and his daughter with a nerve agent, mm-hmm, endangering hundreds, maybe thousands of people. And what you could have said was an act of war. Mm-hmm. And so what the United States did, and what President Trump ordered at the time, was the closing of their consulate in San Francisco, which was a huge intelligence platform for them, and expelling of a lot of these undeclared intelligence agents that actually were a threat not only to us directly, but they were a big part of the disinformation and information warfare efforts associated with the 2016 election.
What do you think explains President Trump's very friendly rhetoric toward President Putin?
I can't really explain it. I think that it fits into a pattern. What I describe in Battlegrounds is this persistent belief across three administrations that really Vladimir Putin is going to change. I mean, I think we envision him kind of as the Grinch on Christmas Eve, right? Like his heart's going to grow 2 sizes bigger, and he's just going to become a better person. Mm-hmm. It's not going to happen. And what I describe in the book are the emotions, the ideology, the aspirations that drive Vladimir Putin. Mm-hmm. Remember President George H.W. Bush looked into Putin's soul, and President Obama leaned over to Medvedev, who was keeping the seat warm for Putin until he came back again as president, and said, hey, we can work with you after the elections, and traded off missile defense in Poland for the better relationship, which didn't come. And Secretary Clinton had the reset button, and President Trump says things that that I think are overly generous, to put it mildly, toward a very hostile leader of what has become a revisionist power. Now, that doesn't mean we shouldn't have some decent relations with Russia and Russians where we can cooperate, but I think we ought to keep our expectations really low as long as Putin is in power.
When you look at the administration's handling of Afghanistan, North Korea, Iran, etc., do you think the United States is safer than it was 4 years ago, or more at risk?
I think the United States is safer in certain areas and more at risk in other areas. And what I describe in the book is I do my best to be nonpartisan and be equally critical, and where I think it's warranted, equally laudatory across political parties. I mean, what I think we all have to realize is, right, it doesn't matter if you're a Democrat or a Republican. You don't want North Korea to have the most destructive weapons on earth. Whether you're a Democrat or a Republican, you don't want jihadist terrorist organizations to have the capability to attack the United States. You don't want China to be able to export its authoritarian mercantilist model at our expense, right? And it's 19 years since 9/11, but we should all remember when those attacks hit our country, Osama bin Laden wasn't targeting Democrats or Republicans. He was targeting Americans. So I think it's time for us to come together around these issues, be critical of both parties, and I think develop this common understanding that I hope can lead over time to a nonpartisan or bipartisan foreign policy.
President Trump's relationship with the military has become increasingly strained in recent months. There was a report that he referred to World War I soldiers as suckers and losers. He publicly called military leaders essentially warmongers who were doing the bidding of defense contractors. How did you react as a combat veteran, a military leader, the father of a soldier, to those remarks? Excuse me.
Yeah. Well, I mean, all of these remarks I think are regrettable. I don't know if the remark about fallen soldiers being losers and everything. I can't imagine that he said that. I wasn't there. I can't comment on that. Mm-hmm. I can comment on what he said publicly, and would just say that it's regrettable that the military is being drug in to partisan politics. And we have to be really careful, and we have to be really responsible across both political parties to prevent that from happening. We should remember that George Washington's family fled the English Civil War. And as a result, he was determined that there would be a bold line between the military and our democratic form of governance. And so all of our founders were also very, very struck by that legacy of Oliver Cromwell and the Civil War. And so whether you have the president making comments about the military that seem to be political in nature, or the other presidential candidate, saying that the militaries could have a role in the transition between our governments. That's the worst thing that could happen. Mm-hmm. And even saying it, I think, is irresponsible. And so I just hope that really all political leaders will recognize the importance of our military remaining apolitical.
What went through your mind when you saw General Milley walk across Lafayette Square with the president after the protesters were dispersed for the photo op in front of the church there?
Well, I think it was unfortunate because especially the way that Lafayette Square became a touchstone and came to dominate discussions about the military's role during the protests and the civil unrest. And then what it was portrayed as, inaccurately, is that the military is there to act against protesters. That's not the case ever. The military and the National Guard, or if federal forces ever were committed, they would be there to protect the protesters and to ensure that criminals and looters didn't use the protests to advance their criminal or an extremist agenda. And I think what you see across the country, with a few exceptions where poor decisions were made, is that our National Guard did a phenomenal job and built tremendous positive relationships with their fellow citizens, because guess what? I mean, they come from their fellow citizens. And I think the way that Lafayette Park was used, by the administration initially, but then also used by opponents of the administration, misframed the military's role and led to a misunderstanding, again, that could drag the military closer into this politicized, vitriolic situation that we're in, that's regrettable, and that we have to really, I think, keep away from our military institutions.
Well, I'm wondering how much you think President Trump is responsible for muddying this line that you talked about that is so important to keep the military out of politics.
Well, I think there's a lot of responsibility to go along. I mean, I think it's clear from my perspective, that Lafayette Square was a mistake, right, as a photo opportunity and the way that it was interpreted. But I think it's also important to recognize that the reaction to it, in many ways, also created a very negative dynamic. And so we just have to be aware, I think, of every reaction does not deserve an equal and opposite reaction, because in doing so, we're creating this destructive cycle and these centripetal forces they're pulling us apart from each other, and we're forgetting who we are as Americans. We can either transcend it or get drugged down into it. And I think all of us have to do our part to try to transcend it.
Just yesterday, President Trump said that General Mattis was a terrible general, that he's overrated, and he made these comments in confirming that he had tried to order the assassination of Syrian President Bashar Assad. Were you part of those discussions?
No, I was not part of those discussions. I think those discussions may have occurred after I left.
Have you ever heard the president use language that disparages military leaders or soldiers?
No, I mean, I have heard language with the president. As you know, I mean, he's not hesitant to disparage anybody, right? Who he thinks is not supporting his agenda, but not in a way. When I served in the White House, that I felt was not, was not an entree to a conversation with him about it. So the president's very brash and unconventional, and I was okay with that. I mean, I don't agree with much of what the president says. I mean, I regret some things he says, but I didn't see it as my job to be the arbiter of his tweets or statements.
Did he disparage your service in conversations with you or with others?
No, never with me.
Okay. I want to ask about Ukraine and President Trump's discussions with foreign leaders. Did you ever hear him pressure a foreign leader for political favors?
No, I never heard him do it.
And I know you said after the revelations came out about his conversation with Ukraine's President Zelensky that it was inappropriate to solicit interference in the 2020 election. Do you think impeachment was the correct course of action?
Well, I mean, that's up to the House of Representatives, right? And I think what's important for us is to have confidence in the separation of powers and the system that our founders set up, and recognizing, as they did in the Federalist Papers, the danger of factions, read political parties, and how the polarization could lead to a lack of confidence in our democracy. So I think at this time, especially in this election period and all the discussions you hear about transition, we should have confidence in what our founders set up. That was the House's decision. Now, and that's not for me to comment on, I don't believe.
After the president was acquitted, Lieutenant Colonel Vindman and his brother were both fired from the NSC because Vindman raised concerns about the call. How do you think they were treated?
Well, my reaction was initially, I can't believe he was still there because, you're there to serve the president at the pleasure of the president, right? And the NSC staff has to be a valued and trusted organization across the departments and agencies, but especially with the president, right? Because that's the organization that provides the president with options, and then once the president makes decisions, to assist with the sensible implementation of his decisions, again, with the departments and agencies doing that implementation. And so serving in the NSC staff is not a right. Now, I think looking at Lieutenant Colonel Vindman's record, he has a great record. He's made tremendous contributions to our nation. I felt that he should have had the opportunity to go on to continue, certainly to make contributions to our country as an officer in our Army in other capacities. But I think at that stage, it was probably kind of logical that he move off the NSC staff.
Okay. So you feel like he was treated fairly given presidential prerogative?
Well, I mean, that's, again, not for me to judge, but I think that it would have been difficult for anyone, who was involved at that stage, in the inquiry initially, and then in the impeachment and the Senate and the trial. It would have been difficult to continue to go into the Eisenhower Executive Office Building every day, right across from the White House, and serve the president well, without the baggage associated with the inquiry and the impeachment and so forth.
Did you ever have any dealings with the president's lawyer, Rudy Giuliani?
I did on a few occasions.
What were those?
Well, they were just on discussions about the advice on particular issues. Nothing that that the president acted on, really. The president, as people know, I mean, and what I write about in Battlegrounds is that he tends to cast his net widely in terms of perspectives that he listens to. I saw it as my job when anybody is giving him that kind of advice to just grab that advice, right, or that idea, and try to bring it into our sort of inclusive tent and into our transparent process, so that there weren't end runs around a system that would do the president a disservice. I think what any president deserves is the best analysis from across the departments and agencies and multiple options, so that he or she can make the best decision consistent with what their agenda is, right? Because what people, I think, sometimes forget, it's really the president, maybe the vice president, are the only two people in that White House who were elected, really in the administration who were elected. So it's not your job to make policy. It's your job to help the president make the best policy possible.
Did Giuliani ask you about Ukraine?
I can't really talk about any specific discussions within the context of the Oval Office, but
did you feel like he was pressing for something that was inappropriate?
Well, he's a lawyer, right? He's an advocate, and he's someone that was trusted by the president. So he had ideas, right? He had ideas and viewpoints, and the president consulted, as I mentioned, a wide range of sources of advice, including my successor, who I sat in with meetings in the Oval Office, and many others. But I saw it as my job. What's interesting about the National Security Advisor job is that you're the only person within the foreign policy and national security establishment who has the president as his or her only client. And so it's your job to make sure the president's being well served. And so whenever I identified a conversation that was going to be relevant to national security or to foreign policy, I made it my business to be there and to ensure that perspective could be placed in context, right, of other considerations and our national interests.
Did you ever raise concerns about Giuliani's activities with either the Department of Justice or with ethics folks inside the White House?
I can't really talk about any of my duties inside of that, inside of the White House. I mean, other people have decided that they should talk about those, but I think it's a violation of trust. And I think what's really important about the National Security Advisor job is that the president has to trust that person, or else, right, I think all future presidents will have a lack of trust for the National Security Advisor. And then that lack of trust is in and of itself, that's a showstopper, right? Because you have to be able to have frank discussions. And the president has to be able to say, what he or she wants to say and not think that it's going to appear in print before their term is up.
Your successor, John Bolton, wrote a very different kind of book than you have. He compared working into the White House to being inside a pinball machine. He described President Trump as ill-informed, erratic, and driven entirely by his own personal political needs. Yeah. How would you describe working for the president? How would you describe the president's decision-making?
Well, you might recall right before I came in, right? Of course, my successor left on short notice, under difficult circumstances, and I think the quotation from the president around that time is that the White House was a well-oiled machine. Mm-hmm. Well, so I would say I would not have described it that way, but I saw it as my job, right, to really help put together a process that served the president well, and I think we did it. I think we got some very positive policy outcomes as a result, right? So again, it was not my job to make policy. It was my job to provide the president with options, plural, and then to in the presentation of those options, which I think works well with any president, is to then you can examine the advantages and disadvantages, the risks associated with each of those courses of action, the cost associated with them. And you can have the kind of discussion that lends itself to the best possible decision. And we were able to do that, I think, on a number of counts. I think we implemented very early in the administration the most significant shift in foreign policy since the end of the Cold War. And that's the shift from the so-called engagement approach to China. And what I write about in the book are the new set of assumptions that we established for a fundamentally new approach to China, which I believe has really strong bipartisan support and strong support from the American people as well.
Well, you said you wouldn't describe it as a well-oiled machine, so how would you have described it when you came in?
Well, I think, any transition of administrations is difficult. And I'm a historian. I wrote about the transition between Kennedy, an unexpected transition, right. And it was an unexpected transition to President Trump, as you might recall as well, yes. because the polls said otherwise, right? So, right. But it was a tragic, obviously, transition after John F. Kennedy's assassination, and even though Lyndon Johnson kept on, the same advisors, really, right? It was still a very difficult transition with a new president who had a different agenda than John F. Kennedy, and certainly a much different style. So having written about that from a historical perspective, and written about national security decision-making, foreign policy decision-making in the Vietnam period, I was determined to at least avoid the pitfalls that I was aware of as an historian. Mm-hmm. And in the conclusion of Battlegrounds, I describe how really surreal it was to walk into McGeorge Bundy's office, right? Mm-hmm. I had written about the role of the National Security Advisor in establishing a national security decision-making process, and hey, now I was in charge of it, right? And so I really felt that it was a gift that I had been able to write about it from a historical perspective, and I think we put in place a process that I describe in Battlegrounds that helped us avoid at least the pitfalls I was aware of from previous administrations and previous transitions.
As you were leaving the White House, you did say that the environment was toxic. Can you just elaborate on that? I mean, what was so toxic about it?
Well, when I first got it was my first assignment in Washington, right? No, I wasn't naive about it, right? Because I'd written about it, I'd studied it, I taught it, the national security decision making, and but a friend of mine who I called up for advice, who has a long time in Washington, he said, well, if you go into a snake pit, you have to be ready to handle snakes, Mm-hmm. and then other trite phrases were, well, in Washington, your friends stab you in the chest. And so what I realized, Deirdre, is that in the military, I think the vast majority of serving officers and non-commissioned officers and soldiers, they're there to serve the Constitution, right? And to serve their country. And in this case, that mentality of service means providing the president with options, helping the president determine his or her agenda, and assisting with the implementations of their decisions. So that's one group of people that are in a White House or in Washington broadly. But there's a second group of people in Washington. They're not there to help the elected president pursue his or her agenda. They are there to pursue their own agenda. And that's either, their pet rock that they want in place, their policy they want in place on, Iran or immigration or trade or fill in the blank. Or they're there for a personal agenda because they fancy themselves as a future Secretary of State, and whatever they're doing in government is a stepping stone to that next job. And then there's a third group of people who are there really not to help the president identify his or her agenda or their own agenda, as much as they're there to stop the president from implementing his or her agenda, and under the theory that they're there to save the country or the world from the president. Now, those second and third groups are dangerous to the Constitution because nobody elected them. And the radical idea of our revolution is that sovereignty lies with the people, and they exercise that sovereignty through elections. So if you have political appointees or civil servants blocking the agenda of the elected executive, they're denying the American people a say in how they're governed. So I think it was really important to bring those groups in and to try to make them see the benefit of advancing their agenda through a process that, while I was there, I believe delivered good foreign policy outcomes.
You seem to go out of your way to not criticize President Trump directly, but it's clear from other accounts that he didn't necessarily read your briefing materials, didn't fully absorb the verbal presentations that you gave. How much did that frustrate you or concern you?
I'll tell you, my second day on the job, I gathered our whole team together, right? Because there's anxiety, right? There had been a change in leadership. It was already a turbulent transition between administrations. And first, I wanted the whole team to know who I was, to introduce myself, to share with them my thoughts about really what the NSC staff is for, how we can work together. But I also wanted to impart to them that, having studied the National Security Council staff from a historical perspective, we could go about it one of two ways. We could say, hey, we are going to come up with the perfect process, the perfect papers and briefing materials, and we're going to tell the president, we want you to conform to our process and our materials. Or we can figure out how the president receives information and adopt and adapt our products, and to a certain extent our process, at least as it interacts with the president, the kinds of meetings he likes, the numbers of people there, the right venue for the right issue. And I think that was the right approach, and that's what I tried to do. And I think in that job, there aren't many who serve a long time in that job. There's some exceptions to that. But I knew I was going to get used up doing that, right? Because actually, when the process works, and I describe this in the book, when the process works, some people want to undermine it because, again, they don't want the process to work. Instead, they want to advance their own narrow agendas.
Do you plan to vote for President Trump in November?
I will never endorse anybody, I would say, because, I entered West Point when I was 17 years old, and I had read a biography of George Marshall, and he was the paragon of military professionalism. Mm-hmm. He chose never to vote. And so across my 34-year career in the Army, I never voted. And I don't expect others in the military not to vote. I encourage others to vote, that's fine. But my personal choice was I was going to be studiously, maybe in an extreme way, apolitical, as a way to keep our profession apolitical. And so I'm determined, even in retirement, not to be drug into partisan politics.
Well, what concerns do you have about a second Trump administration or a Biden administration?
What I have concerns about is that no matter who's elected, whether it's President Trump or President Biden, I'm worried about what we're going to do to ourselves. It seems to me like we've lost the ability to empathize with one another. And I think if empathy is over, we're going to have a very difficult time really understanding who we are as a people and really restoring what's necessary. And I write about this in Battlegrounds, that I quote a philosopher, Richard Rorty, who said that for, in nations, pride in your nation is analogous to self-respect in an individual. Mm-hmm. It's a requirement for self-improvement. And so I think we need to have civil discussions. That's what Battlegrounds is about. I wanted to put a book out there that was not one of the, maybe thousands of books on palace intrigue, and tell-alls, and try to transcend it I mean, there are fun stories in there, for readers, and there's. I hope I've created some degree of narrative quality with those stories about these issues, so I can, so readers will enjoy learning about the historical backgrounds of these challenges to national and international security. But I didn't think it would be useful to write a book, another palace intrigue, and another book like that.
What are the biggest global threats facing the U.S. right now, and what keeps you up at night?
Right. Well, it's a combination of threats, and I think what is important to recognize is that none of these are distinct from one another. Right? Our adversaries and our rivals, they often coordinate their actions, or they take advantage of problems that we're encountering or opportunities that they see. And what we're seeing now, in the wake of our triple kind of crisis right now of COVID-19, the recession associated with COVID-19, and the civil unrest and disparities and inequalities laid bare by the murder of George Floyd and the response to that across our country, I think we are in a position of perceived weakness by our rivals. And our rivals feel emboldened. I would put foremost among them the Chinese Communist Party. And just take a look at this so-called wolf warrior diplomacy that the Chinese, after foisting the pandemic on the world, have engaged in this jingoistic approach in which they're saying, look, hey, our authoritarian system works. Look, your democracy is failing. And so I think that our adversaries are emboldened. I mean, Russia has a lot of problems. China has a lot of problems too. But Russia has shown as well that they're willing to act aggressively by poisoning, Putin's greatest rival, political rival. And look at what China's done. Right? They're bludgeoning Indian soldiers to death on the Himalayan frontier. They're suppressing freedom in Hong Kong. They are trying to engage in the biggest land grab, so to speak, in history in the South China Sea. They're threatening Taiwan. They're threatening Japan with the Senkakus. I mean, and they're conducting massive cyber attacks against Australia. Right? And so we have to recognize that these threats are not abating during what I think will be a necessary period of introspection for us. So I think. As I mentioned, jihadist terrorism is a threat. We can't disengage from that problem set as an emotional cathartic because we want the wars to be over. And of course, other adversaries are figuring out ways that they can be more harmful to us. I think Iran is close to the top of that list. And what I write about in Battlegrounds is none of these threats are wholly unprecedented, but there are new capabilities. Offensive cyber capabilities, for example, drone attacks like we saw against Saudi oil fields, for example, by the Iranians just earlier this end of last year, that make the world even more dangerous. And I think, and what I argue for in the book, is that argues for continued engagement, because as we've learned with COVID-19, if you don't address a problem overseas and contain it, once it reaches our shores, the cost can become very difficult to bear.
Would you say yes to National Security Advisor role again, knowing what you know now?
Hey, I would. I think it's the best job in Washington. Honestly, I mean, so you get to do 5 things as a National Security Advisor, and they're all fun on most days. And some days it's not fun, but most days they're fun. The first is you staff the president, right? You provide the president with the best analysis that you can and prepare the president for any engagements on foreign policy or national security. The second thing is you run that process. And I ran it on the model that is associated with Brent Scowcroft, who recently passed away. What a fine gentleman, what a wonderful man, and great public servant. And again, to give the president options, right, and to assist with sensible implementation. The third thing you do, and I tried not to do this as much, is to communicate the president's decisions. I try not to do it publicly, but when others are reluctant to go on the Sunday shows and so forth, I had to do some of that. But you have to communicate the president's decisions and policies to relevant audiences within the government, but on Capitol Hill and foreign audiences. The fourth thing you have to do is try to maintain kind of unity of effort among like-minded countries. And I had a great relationship with my National Security Advisor counterparts. I mean, it was like a fun club to be in. And then finally, you lead an organization of really tremendously dedicated civil servants. And I think Americans, they ought to not be reluctant to serve their country. You can make a big difference. And I think the National Security Council staff did every day while I was there. I mean, these were wonderful people. And you have to, as a leader, you have to create an environment where people are bound together by mutual respect and common purpose. That they know that their hard work is paying off in terms of results, and you try to insulate them, from the vitriol and the attacks that are now so common now. I mean, it used to be that we disagreed about issues, but now everything goes ad hominem. It becomes personal very quickly, and it's regrettable. It's regrettable that people who are in our government to serve have to put up with it. But I just hope Americans are not discouraged to serve, whether in our military, certainly, but also as civil servants.
So you've written this book, you've retired from the military. What's next for you?
Well, I'm going to start working on other projects. I've been teaching at Stanford, which I really enjoy. I love working with the students there, and my research assistants were wonderful to work with on this book. We had like a little colloquium going on across a year and a half on all of these issues, and I really want to get the word that I have in the book, the analysis I have in the book. I want to get it out there. I write about this at the end of the book. I think the book will have accomplished its purpose if it generates meaningful and respectful debates and discussions about the greatest challenges we face. Because everything I do these days, I want to make a small contribution to helping build a better future for generations to come. And I think we're in a bad time in our country, but hey, when we faced duress in the past, we've come out stronger. And I think we have to believe that our experiment in democracy and democratic government, our republic, it's always been imperfect. But what's great about our system is, hey, we all have a say in how we're governed. I mean, if you're in communist China, you don't have a say in how you're governed. So I think even as we're disappointed with so much these days, we ought to also be thankful for what we have, and then we can take on responsibility for making our country better.
Great. Well, thank you so much for taking so much time and answering all my questions. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, Deirdre. It was great to be with you. Thank you.